welcome to Geography Gen. Today I'm going to be talking about what a carbon footprint is. So, every product that is sold in a supermarket has a carbon footprint, and a carbon footprint is the amount of CO2 or equivalent gas which is released up into the atmosphere in the production of that product. Now, it is not the same as a food mile. A carbon footprint is the amount of gas released into the atmosphere, whereas food miles is the distance between where the product is produced or harvested and where it's sold. So they are slightly different. So when you're working out how much of a carbon footprint a product has, you have to take into account lots of different things. So first of all, you have to take into account how much CO2 is produced by the actual land that's being used. I'll give you an example of that. In Brazil, in the Amazon rainforest, and I shall show you this on a map. So if I zoom around and we have a little look and we find South America and we find Brazil. So you may know a little bit about Brazil already, but in Brazil there is a huge forest called the Amazon rainforest, and that's been deforested. It's been cut down. Now, if you decide to cut down somewhere like the Amazon rainforest and you decide to, say, put cows on the land, then you have to cut all the trees down and burn them. The minute you do that, your carbon footprint is huge because you are releasing loads and loads of emissions from those trees which store carbon up into the atmosphere. Then you've got to look at the next stage, which is what emissions come from the product that you decide to put on that piece of land. So for example, I was going to use an example of beef, and I've actually brought some beef with me. So here's some beef. So beef comes from cows. All right, so you need to put a herd of cows onto the land. Now in the Amazon rainforest, they quite often clear the land and they put cows on the land, and this is called cattle ranching. Now cows, when they fart, produce large amounts of methane, which goes up into the atmosphere and would add to the carbon footprint of a product like beef. Then you have to look at the processing of that product. So let's say you wanted to turn that beef into a beef burger. Now it's got to go to a factory. That factory uses electricity, so that adds to the carbon footprint. The next stage would be the transportation of that product. So you might have something like your beef burger, you've got to transport it all the way from one place to another, from one country to another. That would add to the carbon footprint through the fuel use. And then finally, you've got the packaging of the product, which could also add to the CO2 emissions. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. The first one I just mentioned before was beef. Cattle ranching, particularly in a place like the Amazon rainforest, is particularly high in its carbon footprint. China import quite a lot of beef from Brazil, and that is going to have a really big impact on the environment. There is an example as well, a little bit closer to home, which is poultry or chicken. So it's a little bit complicated, this, because you might think if you go to the supermarket and buy some chicken that's grown in the local area or reared in the local area, that it has quite a low carbon footprint. And in theory, you'd be right. The problem is, in Brazil, in the Amazon rainforest, they quite often grow soybeans. And those soybeans are transported to the United Kingdom and used as feed for the chickens, for the poultry. So just got to be a little bit careful there. It doesn't necessarily mean that a product, just because the food miles is low, has a low carbon footprint. Right, another example would be cheese, which is a relatively high carbon footprint as well. The reason why cheese is relatively high is because, once again, it comes from cows. Cows produce methane, and in addition this needs refrigerating, so this has to be kept cold when you transport it from one country or one place to another, and that also releases CO2 through electricity. Now another example would be bananas. Okay. Now bananas have a relatively low carbon footprint because they don't require very much processing, and they can be transported by ship in huge bulk, so they don't actually have that higher carbon footprint. You might think that they're going to be high because they have a lot of food miles, but actually bananas are relatively low. There is one really strange example which I was just going to point out to you. So I've got some cashew nuts here. Now cashew nuts have to be imported, so you'd think maybe that cashew nuts would have a larger carbon footprint, but some cashew nuts actually have a negative carbon footprint. So they take carbon out of the atmosphere. How on earth is that possible? Well, what happens is because they're so small, you can transport them in bulk, so they do release some carbon dioxide through transportation, but the planting of the cashew tree itself takes in CO2 out of the atmosphere. So the tree takes in CO2 and gives out oxygen. So that actually massively reduces its carbon footprint, so nuts are quite low. Now, if you're thinking about your social responsibility, like how do you know the products that you buy from the supermarket are, don't have a massive carbon footprint? Well, the answer is it's quite difficult to know that, because as I mentioned, with things like chickens, you don't know how they've been fed. But I would say, as a rule of thumb, so if you're thinking about this or you're concerned about it, the main thing is try and buy things that are seasonal, that are grown in the UK, that are grown near to you, if you possibly can. If you're buying products that are grown from, a long distance away, from far away, they are going to require more transportation, and any form of beef production is not really sustainable and will produce methane and carbon dioxide. So if you can avoid eating meats like that, that would also be really helpful in reducing your personal carbon footprint.